Hi, welcome everyone to Save the Date, your dating survival guide from Coffee Meets Bagel. I'm your host, Dawoon, and CMB's Chief Dating Officer. Each episode, I invite a dating expert to explore what it takes to go on great dates and ultimately find a great relationship. So we all know what we want in our dating life, which is obviously to find a great relationship. So what is stopping us from getting there? Well, there could be a lot of factors, but sometimes it's actually us ourselves who's getting in the way of us finding the happy relationship that we want, which is why I'm so excited to have Lori today here with me and to help us understand how we can stop sabotaging our own happiness when it comes to our dating life. Lori Gottlieb is a psychotherapist and author of not one, but two New York Times bestselling books. Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which is currently being adopted as a TV series, and Marry Him, The Case for Settling for Mr. Good Enough. In addition to being an author in her clinical practice, she writes the Atlantic's weekly Dear Therapist column and also is a co-host of a new hit podcast, Dear Therapist, which I love to listen to. And it has an amazing TED Talk with millions and millions of views that we all should check out. So thank you so much, Lori, for joining.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's talk first about your book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which I really, really enjoyed reading. And in the book, you talk about your story as a therapist and also talk about some of the stories of your patients. And I love the fact that we all get to learn from their experiences that you share. It's almost as if we're in the therapy session with them. I want to talk about one patient that you talk about, which is Charlotte. And in the book, you describe her as a patient in her mid-20s who feels anxious, is bored at her job, and has no significant romantic relationship because she keeps going after the unavailable type. I think a lot of our daters could relate to that problem. Could we talk about why we do this and how you help somebody like Charlotte?
Yeah, I think Charlotte is a great example of what so many people do. So Charlotte is a woman in her 20s and she's, on paper, she looks great, right? She's got like the job she likes, she's got friends, she's, social, all of those things. But she really has trouble meeting a guy who isn't going to disappoint her in some way. And I think that the tendency for people is to say, oh, well, there are no good guys out there, right?
Mhm.
And it could be anybody, like there are no good girls out there. There's no good, it's just, I think that when we can't find the person, we tend to blame it on the availability of the significant other that we're looking for. And in reality, sometimes what happens is we are sabotaging ourselves by going after people who are not the right people for us. And
Yeah.
so I think you see that with Charlotte over and over, where you know that every time there's a new person in her life, it looks exactly like the kind of person she dated before.
Right.
And he can see that, but she can't see that.
Yeah. Why do you do that?
Yeah. Well, in Charlotte's case, I mean, I think it's a great example, and I hope that people will read her story because, she does this thing where we go after what's familiar. And when she grew up, she had a parent who was, on the one hand, very available and then would disappear, and very available and then would disappear. And so those are the kinds of guys she picked. So why would we do that, right? Why would we go after some kind of type that hurt us in the past? And it's because we go after the familiar. It's kind of like you meet someone and you think in your head, I'm going to pick someone who was the opposite of that parent, that person who hurt me growing up. But what
Mhm.
happens is we have radar for what feels comfortable, what feels like home. And so we go after people where it's kind of like, you look familiar, come closer, is what our unconscious says. But in our conscious mind, we think, oh, that person's nothing like anybody else, yet they're exactly the same. So there's this saying, we marry our unfinished business, right?
I love
And
that.
I think that when you're dating, it's really important to figure out what business needs to get finished so that
Yeah.
you can go after people who are going to give you the kind of relationship experience that you want.
Yeah. And, like, so that we're more liberated in our choices when it comes to our partner and not that I can relate to that so much. I think it's really important to understand that just because we feel attracted to somebody doesn't mean that they're actually a good partner. It really could be because it's something that reminds of us of our home or unfinished business that just like compels us to be like drawn to that. And I think it's so important to know that this is a phenomenon that happens often.
Well, right. And when we talk about being drawn to people, we talk about chemistry. Sometimes chemistry is, again, there's healthy chemistry, which is you're really drawn to somebody for healthy reasons, but there's also unhealthy chemistry where you're immediately drawn to somebody because of this unfinished business. And so it's really important to be able to tease that out.
Right. So, Lori, as a therapist, how do you help your client who's experiencing like this, something like this, break out of this cycle?
Yeah. So as therapists, we talk about the difference between what we call idiot compassion and wise compassion. Idiot compassion is what our friends do. So, your friend goes out on a date or they're dating somebody and they say, listen to what this person did. And they tell some story, right? And we say, yeah, they're terrible. They were awful. You're right. They were wrong. That's idiot compassion. We just go along with the story and we think we're being supportive. Wise compassion is what a therapist does. So what we do as therapists is we hold up a mirror to you and we help you to see something about yourself that maybe you haven't been willing or able to see. And so in Charlotte's case, it's kind of like, let's look at at one point she starts dating somebody from the waiting room,
Right.
That she meets in the waiting room at our offices who's seeing another therapist in our suite. And I know immediately that, I don't know anything about this guy, but I know just because of her pattern that this is not going to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course he has a girlfriend, it turns out, and it's like an addiction. And sometimes what happens is when you look and you say, why am I so drawn to people who I know from very early on are problematic for me? Then you start to say, what is the draw? What is the kind of addiction to this? And that's where holding up the mirror helps. It's kind of like, are you trying to recreate a situation where this time it'll work out with this person who's problematic? Or can you go into that place of uncertainty, the unknown? A lot of people would pick the familiar over doing the healthy thing because at least they know the familiar.
Right.
And if you do something different, what happens is these people, they go out on dates and they say, yeah, that person seems great, but I just had no chemistry with them. I'm just not attracted to them. And that's really anxiety of, I don't know what it's like to be with a healthy person, so I feel nothing. But it's not that you're feeling nothing, it's that your anxiety is shutting it down.
Right, right. So I guess we have to, there's no other way other than just kind of experiencing that and be with it for a little bit until you feel okay. If that becomes familiar.
Well, yes. And I think what happens is people will go out on a first date and if they don't have that kind of chemistry that they had with the people who were problematic, they say there's nothing there. So I say, if you had a good time on the date, a good enough time, it was like, you could spend another hour with this person, go on another date, go on maybe 2 more dates. And then if you still feel nothing, okay. But see what happens when you spend more time. See what happens when someone is treating you differently, and see if you start to have a different reaction to them, and see what happens. I think a lot of people, in my other book, in Marry Him, I cite a lot of studies, and one of them, and by the way, the book's not about settling, despite the subtitle. I just want to clarify that. It's about what really matters for happy, lasting relationships. And one of the surveys in that book, there's a study where people were asked, they were followed for 20 years, and they were asked if they were having good marriages. 20 years later, they said, like, tell us about your first date. They would say, oh my gosh, there was chemistry right away. But if you look back at the reports at the time, they were like, yeah, I'm not really sure if I want to go on a second date. So they changed the story over time because of how much they love the person. They didn't even realize they were changing the story. And vice versa for people who were divorced or unhappy in their marriages. When you ask them later, what was your first date like? They would say like, yeah, I wasn't really, and I knew from the beginning it wasn't really right. When at the time they reported, we had this incredible chemistry. So don't put a lot of stock in that first date. The first date is just, did we have a nice conversation? Could I imagine having another conversation with this person? That's all the first date is.
Right, right. There's so many things here that I want to pull out. First of all, I want to share that exactly actually has been my experience with my current partner, and not that like I can generalize with my one example, but I can attest to what you're saying. I think I go into the evidence of our first date was good. It wasn't bad. It wasn't horrible, but it wasn't like, oh my God, I like, this is love at first sight, which I'm sure happens sometimes. But for most of us, that's not what we experience. And that is not what we should be expecting. like you said, we I gave it another chance. He gave it another chance. I'm sure it wasn't like love at first sight for him either. And then we just kind of evolved from there. So I know exactly what you're referring to. And if I had just written him off because I was expecting some love at first sight thing, then this would have never happened. So I think that's such a great advice. I want to go back to the title, like what you were saying, the book is not about settling, because I think that when the book came out a few years ago, it elicited many response, polarizing response. I think the title itself, "Marry Him, Settling for Case for Mr. Case for the Case for Settling for Mr. Good Enough," also was drew a lot of controversy. So can we touch upon that a little bit? Because I think, like you said, it can be misunderstood. And I know that you're not saying that, let's settle. So I'm going to just kind of pointedly ask, are you saying that in order for us to be in a happy relationship, we should just settle?
Absolutely not. Never settle. That is not what the book is about. And I fought against using that title. So, the book is actually, again, it's a highly researched book about what actually makes relationships work for the long term. And that includes chemistry, physical attraction, all of those things. And so, I think that what happened was it was based on an article that was sort of like had a lot of like humor in it, and then they used that as the subtitle. But it really came from this idea that I think in our dating culture, we have this idea that the other person is going to be whatever this idea we have in our mind of what our partner is going to be. And what people find in real life with these really happy relationships is that the person you fall in love with may not match this idea of what you had in your mind. It's like you fall in love with who you fall in love with, and you don't know who that is until you meet that person. And that person is it's not like you could order up a person a la carte and be like, I'll take more of this and less of this personality trait. It's like, it's the whole package. And people forget that, by the way, to be with us, people are taking the whole package too. Right. So, and if you treat dating like a shopping experience, you're not going to have a lot of success. So it's about meeting a real life human being. It's not about like a list of items on a shopping list. And a lot of times people say, like, I thought I was going to be with someone like this, but I ended up falling in love with someone like this. And so what the book does is it kind of takes you through, all of the experts talking about what is important, what are the traps that we fall into. There was a study in the book, in fact, when we talk about sort of like when you try to find people based on traits, like when we think about like coffee meets bagel, right? It's a really good way to say, okay, who do I want to go on a date with? But you have to know how to use these apps well. And part of using these apps is not about like, oh my gosh, they said they like this music, but I don't like that music, so I'm not even going to, engage with that person. It's like you have to look holistically at, is there enough here where I want to have a conversation with this person? But people get very granular. And so they rule out people very, very quickly. And they also juggle too many people at once. So, the apps aren't there. And I'm sure you'd be the first to say this. The apps aren't there so you can date 10 people at once. The apps are there so you can connect with the one person that you want to explore. And so I think what people do is they go out on a date, or they meet someone, or they start texting or chatting or whatever. And they think, well, look at all these 10 other people. And you can't really focus and get to know someone if you're focusing on 10 people at once. So there are a lot of sort of traps that we fall into, thinking like, I'm just going to know immediately when that person falls into my lap. And it actually takes a little bit of work to figure out who that person is going to be in our current society, where you don't necessarily meet people organically in the same way. And that's why these apps are so useful, but you have to know how to use them.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's one of the reasons why, or actually the reason why, when I started Coffee Meets Bagel, we actually started with one bagel a day, giving you one person, because exactly what you said, just swiping and dating a lot of people at 10 people at the same time isn't actually, of course, it could happen, but isn't the most ideal way to get to that deep relationship and connection that you're looking for. And so Coffee Meets Bagel was kind of built on that philosophy. By the way, everyone, the reason why Lori and we got in touch with is because Lori's cousin got married through Coffee Meets Bagel, right?
That's
which
right. She did.
that is so exciting. But anyway, I want to bring up one conversation from the book that really actually it just resonated so well with me, and I think really brings this point home. There's a conversation that you have with Jaya Mala Marathil, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name right, who's an Indian-born researcher who specializes in the topic of arranged marriages, and she got married through arranged marriage herself. And one of the tips that she gives is she basically encourages people to stop focusing on spark or romance on the first date. Which, when I first read that, I was like, "What? That's crazy! That's all I was actually focused on my first date." But rather, learn if there's a good fit value-wise. Basically, first find a good match, then fall in love. Don't fall in love only to learn too late that it's a bad match. Do you agree with this advice?
I would say a modified version of it. I mean, I think that spark is really important, but I think that what you're looking for is spark and compatibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what happens is when people feel spark, they forget about compatibility. So compatibility isn't just, we read the same things, we see that we like the same movies, we both go rollerblading, we both like sushi, right? Compatibility is, what are we wanting in our lives, lifestyle wise? Like, do we both want children? And if so, how many do we want? And, you don't discuss this necessarily in a first date, but you get a sense of as you get to know somebody, like what are they looking for in a partner? What kind of relationship do they want? What kind of future do they want? Do they want to live in a completely different city where you don't want to go?
Mm-hmm.
Do they, how do you feel about work and kids and money and in-laws and, all of the things that are going to be front and center in your marriage? I think that we forget that the dating experience is different from the married experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you judge somebody based on the dating experience and then find out, wait a minute, it was great to date them, but I don't want to do day-to-day life as I get older with this person, you don't want to find that out too late. So
Yeah.
that's really important. And I think part of it too, I should say, is the way that we're dating now. Right now, we're in COVID, so that's different.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're not in COVID, Charlotte, and maybe you should talk to someone. At one point, she's talking about this conversation that she had with the person she was dating, and she's got her thumbs in the air like this. She's like, and then he said, and then I said, and then he said. And at first, I had no idea what she was doing. And then I said, wait a minute, you had this conversation on text?
Yeah.
And she said, yeah. And I tried to explain to her why it was so important to have those conversations in person, so you can look in someone's eyes, you can hold their hand, you can read their body language. And she said, totally unironically, oh no, we also use emojis. And I was like, and this is so typical of people who are dating in their 20s, which is that they don't understand how important it is to actually spend time, again, in non-COVID times, to actually spend time with the person. That so many people are conducting the majority of their relationships are either when they're together, they're having sex, and otherwise when they're having conversations, they're on text.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not actually spending time together where they're just hanging out, doing activities together, having conversations face to face. And that's going to be really important. You're going to learn so much more about your compatibility when we talk about, again, spark versus compatibility. We learn a lot about somebody simply by spending time with them.
Yeah. And not to mention how much misunderstanding is caused by text messages when we're not really there to be able to communicate our emotion. And, what I'm actually getting at, as I hear you is like how much of dating really is about putting ourselves out there. I think a lot of us just rely on text because it is easier. I don't, it's much more nerve wracking to have the same kind of conversation face to face. And I've definitely been there. Even now, even not even just in dating, but any kind of relationship, it is harder to have, it takes more courage to be really, really honest with somebody in real life versus, I can just kind of, texting is a lot easier. I can kind of hide behind the phone. And so much about I think dating is really about putting ourselves out there. And if we really want to be in a happy relationship, we need to be able to willing to take the risk. And sometimes it's going to flop, and I'm sure it's going to feel really uncomfortable at times, but also learning to be kind of okay with it, I think is a big part of dating. And through that we grow, right?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what's funny is when you think about it, if it's like people imagine that they can go into a marriage without having these skills. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, dating is all about getting you ready for prime time, getting you ready for that long-term relationship that most people are looking for. And so when you think about it, if you have no practice having hard conversations, if you have no practice showing the truth of who you are, if you have no practice being vulnerable with your partner, how are you going to have the deep relationship marriage that you want if you've never practiced these skills, right? So I
Right.
think that a lot of people feel like, well, it's a waste of time dating someone if it's not going to be the person. And I say you're going to learn a lot by dating the wrong people. Hopefully you don't date them for very long, but you're going to learn a lot by dating them, so that every time you date the wrong person, it gets you closer to first of all having the skills and the ability to be the kind of partner who will find the right person and has the ability to be in that kind of relationship.
I love that. I love that. I want to bring our conversation to you a little bit. One of the things I love about both books, The Marry Him and also Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, is that you include and you're just so honest and authentic about the emotions and the experiences that you're going through. So let's talk about Marry Him first. You talk very frankly about how you had certain type, and it took a while. Like, just takes the entire audience through the journey of how difficult it is for it was for you to let that actually go, and realizing how that interfered with your goal of finding a happy long-term relationship. What are some other lessons from that book that you think could help our daters who are experiencing something similar right now?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book, and I think this was part of it that I think some people found controversial, but I think we really need to talk about, is that when you are younger, it is not like a lot of people say, oh, I'm in my 20s, I don't need to get serious about anything. And I think that that's the time when you're really learning a lot about yourself in relationship.
Mhm.
And I think that people imagine, I think like back in the day, it was Sex in the City, right? You would just like date and it would be really fun. And that's what dating is. For a lot of people, dating isn't that fun. And I think there's this sort of like cultural thing that dating's supposed to be really fun in your 20s. I think heartbreak is really hard and painful for a lot of people. I think really being vulnerable with people and getting to know them, and then you break up and that person's not in your life anymore. I don't think it's all fun and games. I
Mhm.
think it's really important that you get clear early on about, what am I looking for? Who am I as a person? What baggage do I need to kind of unload, and work through? Um, and I think that what happens is, if people don't take dating seriously in their 20s, they end up in their 30s finding that the dating pool is smaller, because
Mhm.
by then a lot of people now are married. The people who are available maybe were the people who struggled a little bit in their 20s, and maybe they haven't worked through this stuff. And I'm not trying to sound like a doomsday message here. But I just want people to be aware that what you do in your 20s is important, and to use the time wisely. And I'm not saying if you're not married by 30, it's, whatever. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying use your time wisely, so that if you are dating in your 30s and your 40s, whatever, that you've used the time well, and you've learned something about yourself, and you're choosing better.
Yeah, totally. And as somebody who I met my partner in my mid 30s, and I was somebody who dated a lot, and you know, uh, went through a lot of heartbreaks as well. But I did learn a lot from each of those relationships, and I think I was unequivocal about wanting, unequivocally clear about wanting to be in a long-term relationship. I think some of us, I do observe sometimes, because of this cultural pressure, and when we're younger, and if we want a long-term relationship, it's perfectly okay to just want that, and it's not something that's uncool or makes you weak or less independent because you want a long-term relationship when you're young. If that's not what you're looking for, then that's great too. But I just I sometimes I observe that, so I want to make sure that all of our daters, we should feel completely free to own what we want, whether that's long-term relationship or not, and not be pressured to feel like we need to act certain way because of social expectation, and when things should be happening at some age. limit. I think there is a advantage also to be dating later because you also know more about yourself. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, I think that you date with more intention
Yeah.
when you're older. But I think it's true what you're saying about these cultural expectations that a lot of people feel like they can't tell the person that they're dating, yes, I want a serious relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
They feel like, well, then somehow that makes me feel desperate or needy. But no, you're actually quite empowered. You're very confident. You're able to say, listen, you're a great person, but if you're not looking for a serious relationship, we aren't right for each other at this time.
Yeah.
It's perfectly fine to say that.
Right. And like kind of you said, marriage is a or long term relationship is a prime time, and it's our chance to kind of practice being authentic about what we want. Because if we don't know how to do that, are we going to actually be hiding for the rest of our life when it comes to, relationship with our significant other? That's just not great for anyone.
Right. And what I see also is people who, the person says to them, I'm not looking for anything serious right now. And they think, but I'll change them because they're so into me. Like I'll change them and they're going to fall in love with me. And that's like a recipe for disaster.
Mhm.
Maybe in a small percentage of cases that works out, but most times believe people when they tell you what they want. So if they
Exactly.
say, I am not wanting what you're wanting, believe them and move on. Don't waste your time. Don't go through the pain of that.
Right. And everyone, all the daters out there, if you're somebody who's experiencing something similar where um, go and read the book, Marry Him. I mean, it is such a like you did such an extensive research and just such a great way to learn so much about how to date for a long term relationship by learning from your experience. So I highly, highly recommend it. Um, Moving to your the maybe you should talk to someone. So here you also frankly talk about your experience going through a breakup with your boyfriend with a capital B, and how you actually learn to get over that breakup through help of your own therapist. And so for those of us who are experiencing something similar, any words of wisdom that you can share?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that was really helpful was when the breakup happened, my friends all did what I was talking about earlier, idiot compassion, which was like,
Mm.
he's terrible. How could he do this? All of those things. But we have to realize that we're all unreliable narrators. And I actually did a TED talk about this that I recommend that people watch because I think it's very helpful as you try to sort of see what is the faulty narrative that you're carrying around that is holding you back. And so we're all unreliable, not because we're lying, but because we see a story through our particular lens. And
Mm.
so through my particular lens, I told the story. But of course, what I emphasized, what I minimized, what I left out, all of those things my friends did not hear. A therapist does hear that. And so, it turns out that there were a lot of clues along the way that we were not compatible. And that's what I was talking about earlier was you can have a lot of passion and spark, but is the compatibility really there? Compatibility is very hard to force. And if you want different things in life, and in this case, it was about kids versus no kids, then you really have to be able to talk about that and know that it doesn't help anybody to stay in a relationship that ultimately can't work because you're not willing to talk about it. And neither of us was willing to talk about it. We kind of danced around it. And a therapist really helped me to see that and get clear about what really happened and my own role in it. And I think one of the best things you can do after a breakup is to first of all be really kind to yourself
Mhm.
and really compassionate with yourself. And at the same time, when you're not feeling so raw, to be able to say, is there anything that I might do differently going forward?
Mm.
And that again is not a place of criticism or self-blame. It's about really understanding what can I how can I grow from this experience? Because in heartbreak is growth and transformation too. And the other thing I want to say about heartbreak is that so many times we are heartbroken because we think that we miss the other person, but what we actually miss is being in a relationship. We
Mm.
miss the dailiness of it. We miss being known in that way. We miss the inside jokes. We miss the shorthand. We miss the person that we tell all the minutia of the details of our day to. Um, we miss all of the things that are great about relationships, but often it's less about that person And it's more about the fact that we are lonely and we want someone in our lives. And even just saying that, like, I'm lonely and I want someone in my life, in our culture, that's so verboten. It's like, you can't say that. And yet it's very human to want to connect with somebody else. So there's no shame in saying, I'm lonely and I would like to have a partner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Thank you for sharing that insight. In your TED talk about, you alluded a little bit about choosing your own story and how that could actually change your life. And there's an analogy of the jail bar that you mentioned, which I really loved. And I'm wondering how we could actually kind of apply that line of thinking in getting over something like the breakup, or even just COVID in general. Right now, I think a lot of us are experiencing loneliness, and it's really hard being for everyone, but I think especially as a dater, some of us live on our own, very, very far away from our family and friends. I have a hard time connecting with them physically. Like, any tips or that you can share there as it relates to that bar kind of analogy?
Yeah. So the prisoner analogy is, there's this cartoon that my therapist brings up with me, and he says, "You remind me of this prisoner who's, shaking the bars, desperately trying to get out, but on the right and the left, it's open, no bars." In other words, sometimes we are our own jailers.
Mm,
And we don't see that. We blame our situation, our circumstances, whatever it is. But there's also these stories that keep us in prison, that keep us in the jail. And there's stories like, I'm unlovable. I'm never going to meet anyone. I can't trust anyone, because you had a bad experience with somebody else.
yeah.
And all of these stories keep us imprisoned, when we can really walk around those bars and say, wait a minute, maybe there's more to this story. Maybe this story needs some editing. And so in the TED Talk, I kind of take people through how we might do those edits. Certainly you can read, and maybe you should talk to someone in Charlotte's story. You can see how she gets out of her own jail of her own creation, and starts meeting appropriate people. And and you can see how we do that to ourselves, but it has to do with the story. And I think so many times people, when they come to therapy, they think, oh, I'm coming to therapy to get to know myself. And I always say, I think you're coming to therapy to get to unknow yourself, to let
Mm,
go of those limiting stories that you've been carrying around, that are holding you back. So all
mm,
of those stories that you don't even know you're telling yourself, that are just playing in the background. Again, the I'm unlovable, the nothing will ever work out for me, whatever it is. Those are the stories sometimes we don't even realize are playing in the background, and they get in the way every time we interact with somebody.
right. And I'm thinking, going back to your breakup, like some of the stories that I can see, I definitely wrote myself when I was going through a breakup, is that, oh my God, that like I lost the one. This was
Yes,
like the one person that was going to be perfect for me, and I like screwed up. And so now I'm doomed, right? That like I was stuck in that story. And of course, it's not true. And like you said, like probably a truer version of, because like what happened is that I just miss being in a relationship, and I'm forgetting all the reasons why we broke up in the first place, because I am feeling lonely, and I just miss that intimacy, the connection, which feels so nice. And I think it's important to know that, hey, I'm stuck in this story. Like, how can I actually just go around this bar, the bars, like you said?
that reminds me so much of the first episode of our podcast. We have this podcast called Dear Therapists.
Hmm.
And on the first episode, it's about a breakup. And this woman comes on, and basically on the podcast, we do like a therapy session with somebody. They write in their letter, she was going through this breakup, she couldn't get over the guy, and was really heartbroken. And we give them, after the 15-minute session, we give them concrete actionable advice that they have to try within one
Awesome.
week and then they come back and tell us how it worked out. And you can see in just this one 15-minute session how she goes from, I'm totally stuck, I'm heartbroken, I'm obsessed with this guy, I stalk and Google stalking him, I can't, all of those things, to
Hmm.
really feeling like, wait a minute, I feel so differently about this now, right? And there was so
Right.
many things we gave her exercises to do. So if anybody wants to hear that first episode with Shrina on the podcast, it's really helpful. But I think that what you're saying is absolutely true, that we feel like that was the one opportunity. There will never be another opportunity. And I really screwed that up. And maybe there are ways that you could have done things differently in that relationship. But also we tend to idealize the person. Like
Yeah.
we forget that actually maybe they weren't the right person for us
Mhm.
after all. And even if they would have been maybe potentially the right person, that's great. You can learn something from that and do something different the next time.
Right, right. Do you mind sharing that exercise here for the
Yeah,
listeners?
I think they should listen. I think they should listen to it because it's multi-part,
Okay.
and you have to hear her go through it.
Okay, guys, like I listen to Dear Therapist myself. It is such a addictive again, like through storytelling and through all the stories of these people who are writing, kind of similar to maybe you should talk to someone in the book. You just learn so much, and I see so much of myself in their story. So please go and listen to her podcast. I think we may be having some connection issue. Laura, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. I saw you freeze for a
Okay,
second, but I'm here.
great, great. Wow, so time just flew by. So I'm going to move on to our questions from the audience session. And there were so many questions that people submitted that they wanted to ask you about. But of course, I had to pick very few for us to be able to cover. Uh, the first one is I thought could be really relevant to some of the conversations that we had already. How much do you compromise in a relationship? And specifically, should you ever compromise on things you believe are core values?
Okay, so no, not on core values. I think the things you don't compromise on are the character issues. Is
Mm-hmm.
this person kind? Do we know how to do rupture and repair with each other? Meaning, if we disagree, and you will disagree about things, if you're in any kind of intimate relationship, if you're actually connected to each other, how do we repair it? Um, is this person generous? I mean, emotionally generous. Is this person emotionally stable? Right? Do they, have they worked out their stuff? And I don't mean that they're perfect, but I mean, are they in general, do they know how to be in relationship? Are they mature? Are they emotionally mature? Are they able to compromise with you? I think, it turns out that in studies, the characteristics that are most predictive of a successful relationship are flexibility and adaptability.
Mm.
So is the person very rigid, or are they flexible? Because you're going to have to be flexible in a relationship. Are they adaptable to new situations? COVID's a great example. If you look at the people who are thriving during COVID in their relationships, those are the couples where they've been able to be flexible and adaptable with each other, and to offer each other grace under pressure.
Right. I think that is so true from my experience as well. And I'm sure I'm glad that there's research to back that up. I think especially given how much we live like in a long term relationship. Like, okay, so if we meet somebody in 35, like you might be with this somebody for, I don't know, 50, 60 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're gonna change, they're gonna change. And so if we don't have that level of flexibility and openness, then at some point something's going to clash, right? And so
Right.
I think
And I
that's
was
like so important. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say also part of that is, you're right that people change over time. And so letting your partner be who they are. So many times we try to control our partner. You need to be this way for me. We don't say that. We don't even necessarily consciously think that.
Right.
But, you can see in my Atlantic column, I have this weekly column every week called Dear Therapist, and different from the podcast, which is Dear Therapist. But you can see how often people try to, in their letters, like they're so upset about what somebody else is doing, and they're not letting their partner be. So an example is somebody's dating somebody who is divorced,
Mhm.
and they want to control the way that that person interacts with the kids from that marriage, or with the ex, and they're not taking into account why it's important for that person to have this kind of relationship with the first family, right? That came before. When you try to control someone or make them into someone they're not, make sure your partner isn't doing that with you. We all know those controlling people who are like, where were you? The people who like, they have to control your every move. They have to micromanage everything. You can't have any privacy. And there's a difference between, again, secrecy and privacy. Secrecy is something that you're hiding that needs to be out in the open. Privacy is we all need these private places. Like this is my private journal. This is my private conversation with my friend. There are things that I don't tell my partner, right? Because they're private, that have to do with something in my life that's not something that my partner needs to know, that's different from a secret.
Right, right. Such a good point. What are some things that we should be willing to compromise on?
I think just that the things that aren't ultimately going to matter that seem very important while we're dating, and they're different for every person, but some examples are, some common examples would be the way someone dresses, right? These sound so trivial, but you know, they're like someone will say like he would be perfect if he wasn't a freelancer. Okay, well, that's kind of a big lifestyle thing in a way. So you want to make sure that, but are you financially on the same page about things? But this idea that, like, do you have this idea that he needs to make more than you? And if so, what is that about? And, those kinds of things need to really get sussed out.
Yeah.
But people get really hung up on these kind of fantasy ideas of who their partner is going to be. Height is a big one. People will rule out people very quickly early on something very superficial like height.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned that in your book too, right? Because I mean, I've done that myself. I think a lot of us kind of have done that. And ultimately, you're right. I think it's the lens that we should use to kind of uh, decide, hey, this is probably something that I should be okay compromising on. It doesn't matter in the long term. Hobby is another one that I hear a lot, and people mention as like,
Yes.
oh yeah, well, what are you looking for? Oh, somebody with same interest. And
okay.
yeah, please.
So yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So basically, I think that a lot of us, because we don't have the village around us so much anymore, a lot of us don't live near where we grew up. Sometimes we're in a different city. We don't have that village around us. And so a lot of times we rely on our partner to be everything for us. He has to, like, he or she, they have to read the same books. They have to like the same movies. They have to have the same interests, the same hobbies. They have to want to go to museums with me. They have to want to go to the beach with me. They have to want to go swimming with me. All those things. It's like, that's what your friends are for.
Right.
So you want to have areas of overlap, but it doesn't have to be every single thing. And it's really healthy in relationships that you have friends outside of the relationship. That other person can't be everything, and you can't be everything for them either. And you want to have this freshness to the relationship. You're not going to have it if you are, kind of attached at the hip and you don't do anything. You have no outside interests, no outside friends or relationships. You will have nothing new to talk about with each other.
Right, totally. So I see this a lot. Like, oh yeah, I think it's important that we have the same hobby. So I'm so glad that we got to address that. Moving on to the second question: any tips for dating after age 40?
Yeah, I think that I would say there are two things about that. One is that yes, it's going to be a little bit harder because your dating pool is different, but B, you know so much more about who you are in life and what you want at that point. So before, maybe in your 20s, you'll hang out for longer before you really know what's going on. I think when people are dating in their 40s, they're very clear about, or at least the people you want to be dating, are very clear about what it is that they want at this point in their lives. If somebody just got out of a marriage or a long-term relationship, are they looking for one right now, or are they just looking to kind of test the waters? You will know that very early on. Hopefully you'll have that conversation and you'll not waste time. Kids know kids. That comes out very early on as you get older. Things about like money and lifestyle and where you want to live. And you get to know people's families a lot quicker and who their friends are a lot quicker. All of those things are more established in your 40s. They're less fluid. So it's kind of like dating on steroids in a way.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one advantage of dating when you're older.
Yeah, totally. How do you start trusting again after a heartbreak?
Oh, that's the Shrina episode on the podcast.
Oh yeah, right.
But I would say this: don't hold people accountable for the sins of the people you dated before. Wow. That if somebody else committed a crime, let's call them a crime, right? Don't like say the other person is guilty of that crime. It's innocent until proven guilty. So this new person, if they are deemed guilty from the get-go because of something someone else that they have never met has done to you, you're going to ruin that relationship because they are not going to want to be considered a suspect when they've done nothing wrong.
Right. That's such a great advice. And, I'm sure we'll have a natural pull to, like consider them guilty just because of our experience. I think that's kind of human nature. So I think being just aware of that tendency
Right. And you can say, I mean, as you get to know the person, you can say, listen, in my last relationship, here's what happened. I just want to let you know that I'm extra sensitive around that.
Right.
So can we just keep open communication around this? And if the person really wants to be with you, they will say yes. No, if you try to control them and you're like, wait a minute, you were 3 minutes late. What happened? Um, that's a different thing. So it's one thing to say, hey, I'm really sensitive about this. This is what happened. I'm building up my trust again. It's another to try to control the person where you're actually going to push them away. And then you're going to feel like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. See, I can't trust anyone.
Right. That is such a great tip, just being open about what you're experiencing and gives them space to understand where you're coming from.
Yes.
And also, I think vulnerability always builds intimacy. So that conversation itself could actually take the relationship to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Wow, we are up to our final minute. Lori, this has been such a fun conversation. I have a final question I ask every Save the Date guest. What is the best dating advice you've ever received?
Oh, wow. I would say it's less what I've received and more what I've learned,
Mm,
which is that I think that being yourself is going to lead to the relationship that you want. That
mm,
anytime you try to pretzel yourself into something that you think the other person wants, even in a small way, like like in my relationship, and maybe you should talk to someone. I knew that I had a kid. I could tell he wasn't really into the whole kid thing, and I tried to pretend that I didn't notice that, or I tried to pretend that like it was okay that was the case, and we would work around it, right?
right.
But it was not okay. And I think that when you can just be really honest, first with yourself about who you are, then
Yeah.
you can be honest with other people about who you are. And it doesn't mean that, that there's anything wrong with wanting what you want. You want
Right.
what you want, and that's okay. And you have to be willing to be vulnerable in that way, and
Yeah.
say, if this relationship doesn't work out, it's for a good reason.
Yeah, such a great tip. And it is hard, right? It is hard. It takes so much courage to own that and to be honest with yourself and to be honest with the other person. And so it takes practice, and it is going to feel uncomfortable. I think that's what we should be expecting.
Well, I think too that what people do is because they feel like, well, this person has so much of what I want that I'm going to ignore this one
Mm,
aspect, but it's a
mm,
really important aspect. And then other things that people do is they'll sort of take the crumbs, right? They're like, well, this person, I'm really obsessed with this person, and he'll give me like 3 minutes here, and whatever, and they'll like take the crumbs, and it's like, don't take the crumbs. Like,
yeah,
why would you just try to subsist on crumbs? It's not enough. So if you're not getting enough in your relationship, it's really important to be honest with yourself about, I need more. I need something more. I need something different, to communicate that to the other person. And if they aren't up for that, then to be able to say, you know what? I deserve more than the crumbs.
yeah. Well, totally. And it may hurt and would could be painful now, but just I think we need to 100%. I can say this with 100% certainty. It is like the much better and what you want in the long run. If you don't actually do that now, then the time of reckoning is gonna come at some point, and that you don't want that to be like years later, right? And so I think it's just something that really important for us to remember. Where this has been such a great conversation. So if people want to keep in touch with you, learn more, where can they find you? I know we talked about Dear Therapist podcast, but what are some other ways for them to be able to connect with you?
Yeah. Well, they can go to my website, which is lorigottlieb.com. They can buy my book, which is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. They can get it anywhere they buy books. They can listen to my podcast, Dear Therapist, wherever they listen to podcasts. They can read my Atlantic column every Monday at the Atlantic. And they can find me on Instagram at Lori Gottlieb _author. I'm on Twitter at Lori Gottlieb1, and I'm also on Facebook. So um, they'll find me. And I love to connect around, all of these topics, relationships on all of these platforms.
Thank you so much for joining and for the conversation, Lori. I'm a huge fan, and this has been so much fun. And I know it's going to really help a lot of daters out there. For all of you, thank you so much for joining. As usual, All the notes and the resources that Lori mentioned is going to be on our podcast notes and our blog, coffeemeetsbagel.com/blog. And I'll see all of you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye bye. Happy New Year.